Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Today is our fourth and final episode in Hangers-on Week, our look at candidates who stuck around in primary elections for reasons usually noble, sometimes a little ignoble. But I should say, for context, that this is the first in a bunch of these special series that we are planning this year that kind of track the rhythms of an election cycle. So later in the spring and summer, we're going to do a series on Veep stakes and then some stuff around the conventions. We're planning October Surprise Week for the fall, which I'm particularly excited about. But we're still planning it. And so if listeners, any of you have ideas for those kinds of stories or those series that kind of help us understand the rhythms of an election cycle, please let us know. A great way to do that is by subscribing to the newsletter, where we are going to be posting some more behind the scenes information. So you can subscribe to the newsletter at thisdaypod.com and be in touch. Anyway, let's get into it. And today, our final hanger-on, we will go back furthest in time to talk about this. Please welcome to the hangers-on stage Al Smith, serial candidate for president in the 1920s and 30s, someone whose repeated candidacy and hanging on tells us a lot about the politics of that era. And also, of course, please welcome, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So the one thing I think of when I think of Al Smith is that Al Smith dinner, which is a annual white tie dinner here, at least in New York City, that raises money for charities, but is a kind of big thing in New York Democratic politics.
Never heard of that.
I know.
Al Smith dinner.
Yeah.
It was
a big thing in New York.
Yeah, it was a big thing in the 2016 election because it usually involves presidential candidates taking pot shots at one another whenever they come to the Al Smith dinner, and it got a little mean in 2016.
Yeah. I think George Bush got in hot water for some joke he quipped there. I mean, it's sort of, Kellie, like in the roast national correspondence dinner thing where it's like...
I can't stand roast. They make me so uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable because people are being mean to each other, or uncomfortable
and I'm like,
because...
Please stop. Like,
fair
usually
enough.
if people are a good sport, it's fine, but it's too much. I can't take it.
Yeah. And they make me uncomfortable because I'm like, this is a little too chummy, and like, should you really be joking about this kind of stuff? And, you know, the correspondence dinner always feels that way to me, too. But anyway, that is how I mostly know Al Smith, and, you know, I think says a little bit about certainly his legacy as a major political player. We are framing him mostly as a repeated and not successful candidate. He'd sort of considered running in 1920, and maybe that's the election we should start with, because so much of the Al Smith story gets us to, in the wake of World War I, what is the state of American politics? What are the shifting sands between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party? So, you know, let's frame it in that big sense, and then we'll sort of see how Al Smith walks in.
Well, the 1920 election is probably most notable for that slogan of Republican Warren G. Harding, who was calling for a return to normalcy. But that idea of normalcy and a return to it suggests that something was very not normal in 1920. And some of these things were like, you know, you were just coming out of the end of World War I. Woodrow Wilson, who had been president, had been mostly incapacitated for the last year or so of his presidency because of a series of strokes that he had had. There were white riots against black people. There were bombings. There was this Red Scare, the first kind of big backlash to communism in the United States. It was a country in tumult in which there was a lot of violence and unrest, and nobody was quite sure where things were going to go next.
And off the heels of a global pandemic too, the Spanish flu was still very much present. But yeah, I think of the 1920s, and I think of especially the late 19-teens, like 1919. I think of racial violence. I think of an influx of immigration that's causing an intense backlash. And that moment lasted really all throughout the 1920s, but you definitely feel it in that first election.
I mean, backlash seems to be the word and so resonant to right now, but there was a real sort of backlash politics, racial identity, backlash and grievance politics. The Klan is, absolutely resurgent in this moment, but actually a political force. I mean, there were some estimates that show that up to 20% of the House of Representatives owed its election in 1920 to direct Klan support.
Yeah, the Klan in the 1920s, we think of the violent, illegal, murderous Klan, and it still was that too. But it was also this really almost mainstream political force that was working on organizing voters, influencing political candidates. And this is in particular a real issue for the Democratic Party that Al Smith is going to run to represent, because you have, on one hand, you have kind of the end of the Wilson era. Nobody's quite sure what's going to happen to all of that progressive energy that was running through that administration. You have this Klan that's very reactionary. It's anti-immigrant, it's anti-Jew, it's anti-Black, it's anti-Catholic. And so it's not clear which, is that the Democratic Party that the party will be going forward, or will it look like something else? And Al Smith is running to make it look like something else.
Yeah. And it's not exactly sure. I mean, I feel like this election and even 24 is such a sort of a turning point in terms of who is the country willing to be led by? Someone that is going to be, pro-Klan and anti-immigrant, or prohibition, or the alternative. And it's a real sort of linchpin, I think, culturally and socially and even economically to some extent.
Let's talk a little bit about Al Smith as we move into the 1924 election. So Al Smith is from New York City. He was born and raised on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, Italian-American father who fought in the Civil War, Irish-American mother. He, I think, was absolutely at the heart of the kind of Tammany Hall machine, but sort of came out a little unscathed in terms of at least being tarnished by questions of corruption. And so he is, in the New York State Assembly. He rises through the ranks in New York, elected governor several times, and also loses as governor several times. But, he's kind of on that rise, and then starts to get the call to the majors. Are you going to run in 1920? He flirts with it. And then come 1924, it becomes a more serious bid. Now, going into 1924, we framed some of the issues, but it really does feel like, and funnily enough, the Democratic Convention is at Madison Square Garden in 1924, but it really feels like that convention itself, maybe we'll do a proper episode on it when we do our convention series, but at that convention, so many of these issues are in sharp relief as the party, and this is a reminder, the party is kind of hashing things out at the convention itself. The convention is not a sort of pro forma thing. It is really where the party is figuring out who its slate will be and what its main issues and platform are going to be. But let's paint the scene there through the lens of that 24 convention and then how Al Smith is fitting into the picture.
So the frontrunner coming into the Democratic Convention that year is William McAdoo, and he represents the Democratic Party as it was. He represents Southern white voters. He represents rural voters. He is a big defender of prohibition. He is a Protestant. He refuses to repudiate the Klan. And all of this matters because he sort of epitomizes this Democratic Party that still has its roots in both white rural populism and the white Democratic South. And then you have Al Smith, who represents basically everything that the Klan opposes, right? He's Catholic. He's a wet. He was anti-prohibition. He is for immigrants. He is,
pro-labor.
City American, right?
Yeah,
he's from the heart of New York City. And so you have really these two starkly different visions of what the U.S. should look like and what the Democratic Party should look like.
And he's like, I don't know if they were throwing this word around, but, he was like New York liberal elite,
yes.
you can see those seeds in this election. Absolutely. The convention itself is really chaotic and deadlocked. And I think, gosh, we're framing Al Smith as a hanger-on, but, he really had a real shot here, right? And it came very close. So, I think that's one of the lessons we're learning in this series is that people hang on because they actually have a real thread of hope.
Well, and everybody was hanging on in the 1924 Democratic Convention because it goes on for days and days and days and days.
And it's one of the longest conventions ever. I think it's the longest Democratic convention ever. Mm-hmm. And I will flag, Jacob Feldman, our researcher, flagged this one because he knows that I have a theory that basically hydration and temperature are the sort of most important forces in American history, in world history. And so there's no AC. It's incredibly hot. People are at each other's throats because of real issues, but also because, they're sweating. And so,
the climate,
put this on the list.
Nothing. Like fights break out. I don't know about you, but if you're hot or hungry, if you get that hangry feeling, fights were breaking out. It was packed in there too. You had, tens of thousands of people that were gathering. All of the hotels are sold out. People are trying to come out of their clothes. It is so hot. And someone probably steps on a toe and then shoves. And then next thing you know, fights are breaking out. And it's like the Klan are there. 20,000 members of the Klan show up. That's never a good look. And so it quickly dissolves into sort of, pockets of chaos.
Hosted by Lindsey Graham, Wondery's podcast American History Tellers takes you to the events, times, and people that shaped America and Americans. In the latest series, American History Tellers explores the Underground Railroad, a covert network of secret routes and safe houses operated by men and women committed to helping enslaved people escape bondage in the South. Follow American History Tellers on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
And by the time you get to triple digits on the number of ballots, it becomes quite clear. 103rd ballot, right? Yeah. Look, neither McAdoo or Al Smith is going to win this thing. Somebody else has to be put forward as the candidate because neither of them can command a majority. And that's ultimately what happens, Jody, as you said, on the 103rd ballot. Smith and McAdoo bounce, and then they pick a compromise candidate, John W. Davis, the first and last time our listeners will have ever heard that name.
Indeed. So John W. Davis, I love how the New York Times frames this. They say, when the debris began to fall, somebody looked underneath the pile and dragged out John W. Davis. And there he was. 58 different candidates got a vote at some point during that convention. It reminds me of that speaker fight that happened just this last year in the Republican Party in the House. It's 103 ballots. One interesting tidbit is that the New York gamblers who were betting on this, they had John W. Davis as the favorite starting with the 29th round. And so, I'm not advocating.
The books always know.
It's the equivalent of predict it now, right? Which I know some people look at and say, that's the wisdom of the crowd. People are putting their actual money on the line. That's the thing that, but it is funny that the gamblers knew something. We should just listen to them all along. They should have maybe been in charge. Maybe they were in charge in 1924 in New York City. But first off, you get a sort of splinter progressive party, which gets formed there, and it comes out of the Midwest, and they nominate Robert La Follette of Wisconsin. And so you get that as a sort of interesting strain. But nevertheless, this John W. Davis emerges as the compromise candidate after Smith and McAdoo finally withdraw. But I think when people look back at this election, what they really see is the emergence of one FDR as, maybe the only actual winner from a real mess, as the New York Times put it, the pile of debris.
Who was Al Smith's campaign manager. So he was always sort of close to the fight, and to see he was probably taking notes about what to do and what not to do in these circumstances. But, after this, it becomes clear that, in the next, let's call it 10 years or so, he becomes president. But even before that, he becomes this political force to be reckoned with.
He's a rising star in the party, and his sort of glide path to the upper echelons of the Democratic Party are stopped by contracting polio. He's paralyzed from the waist down. This is one of the first big appearances that he makes since he's contracted polio. And he is a really key player for Al Smith, as we will see in future conventions, because he is the waspiest wasp who ever wasped, right? He is a Protestant. He is from the upper elite echelons of American society. And to have somebody like Roosevelt come in and vouch for Smith, who, again, Catholic, it's a tough sell in the United States then and for the next several decades. It becomes important for Roosevelt to be there, but it also shows people that he is still that charismatic, appealing politician who they had known from before the time he contracted polio.
Yeah. So, of course, Coolidge wins that fall in 24. He gets 55% of the vote, I think. John W. Davis gets 28, 29. Not a very good showing, which, of course, then leaves that vacuum for, what's going to happen in the next election, 1928. And, I think, as we've been saying, it largely does coalesce around Al Smith, in part because Roosevelt, I don't think, throws his name in and more says, okay, I'm going to back this guy. But to me, as I think about this series that we've been doing and the kind of lessons of people who run and run but don't necessarily get the nomination, one thing I think I'm learning, and I didn't fully expect going in, or hadn't really sort of been in sharp relief for me going in, was that a lot of times what these candidates do is they point out coalitions that may not have existed before. They actually are showing the party, beyond policy, a kind of demographic and a group of voters. And I feel like that is really the thing that Al Smith shows. He shows that there is like an urban, blue-collar Catholic voters who the Democratic Party can reach. And, he may not be the one to take it over the finish line, but I think it sets a template for others to do so going down the line. And clearly, he doesn't take it over the finish line. We're not talking about Al Smith president, but we're talking about Al Smith, serial, almost.
But this is a big moment. I mean, we've already kind of talked about what that new coalition could look like, that it's urban, it includes Catholics, it's multi-ethnic, it includes immigrants. And in 1928, you begin to see Black voters outside of the South where they have an opportunity to vote. Black men voters are beginning to drift over to the Democratic Party. And that Al Smith is a part of that process because he is modeling a Democratic Party that might be in the North that might be more receptive.
I don't think people give Al Smith his credit for that. It's always sort of like FDR represents that shift for Black voters, but there's always sort of a precursor, and Al Smith represents that precursor, I think, for Black voters. They may not have been voting for Al Smith per se, but for those issues that were important to them, that shift becomes more apparent for FDR.
This shows you how much information I retained from doing this show. But somewhere in the first year of the show, I feel like we did an episode about realignment of Black voters, and it may have been hooked to this 28 election. We had a guest on who wrote a book about this, and it was really brilliant. I forget who it was. We'll go dig it up.
It was Leah Wright Rigueur.
Was it Leah? Oh my gosh.
Kellie's
of course.
other co-host.
Right, yeah.
The loneliness of the Black Republican. Yeah, that's a great book.
Number one friend of the show. That must have been Leah's very first appearance on the show, but she talked about this.
Wild.
And you're right. It's like it starts in that 28 election and goes through kind of into the mid-30s, that realignment or that shift of Black voters from Republican to Democrat. All right. Well, anything else to say about Al Smith himself? And then I want to make some space for kind of thoughts about hangers-on and the sort of things that we've learned.
I think it's interesting that even though Al Smith loses the 24 election, almost immediately his supporters are like, 1928, what are we doing? like they're ready for this next, all right, we're going to keep on trying. And that's kind of the hangers-on spirit, is like, all right, when's the next run? When's the next campaign?
Yeah, I mean, he runs again in 32, right?
Yeah, we should point out the sort of downside of the hanger-on phenomenon is he runs in 32. And of course, that year, Franklin Roosevelt is like, well, you've had your bite at the apple, man. So I'm going to also toss my hat in the ring. And he trounces Al Smith. And Al Smith hangs on too long. And he kind of curdles. He turns against Roosevelt. He turns against the New Deal. There is a kind of I'm taking my ball and going home phenomenon that happens in 1932 with Smith.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, for sure. We should also say, tucked into all of this, he is governor of New York from 1923 to 1928. I mean, he bounces from trying his hat at presidential politics to going back and which I think is a tried and true path of prominent New Yorkers trying their hand at presidential politics and then having to crawl back to the Empire State with their tail tucked between their legs because they couldn't pull it off. But yes, and he has a fun dinner named after him. So what more could you ask? All right. Well, look, we're at the end of this first series that we've, dubbed Hangers On Week. I mean, I kind of gave my sort of thought about one of the big things I've learned. But, I'm thinking back to those sort of initial categories that we laid out with Amy Walter about people who are hanging on to really affect policy, people who are hanging on for ego, people who are hanging on for media exposure, people are hanging on to angle for another job. And it's often a combination of all those too. But I don't know. Do you have any final thoughts on kind of what we make of these hangers-on? Are you less cynical about them now, or are you more cynical about them now?
I will say that I came into this with a bit of cynicism as somebody who studies media and politics after watching all of these people run for office and then get these lucrative contracts with Fox News and other outlets. I was like, oh, they're just hanging around so that they can get their fancy contracts. But I do think that this particular idea that you hang on to actually make real change in what the party could be, or to even just test the theory of the case, that this coalition might be out there, that we might be able to attract this kind of voter. That seems like a pretty important part of the political process. And so maybe hangers-on aren't such a bad thing. Yeah, no,
I maybe I'm a little too optimistic, but I do feel like there are issues that I think would not be on the table had it not been for these, hanger-oners. And I think that has to be grappled with, because eventually, at the end of the day, the final candidates are always still going to have to address those issues for the public, be it about race or gender or, prohibition, whatever the case may be. Someone's going to have to settle that.
Yeah, and I think what both of you are articulating is the key thing, which is you hang on to show which issues connect with actual voters, and that actually is really important. I'm still a little cynical of the phrase, which I think has become a cliche at this point, of I care about these things, so I'm going to stick around to keep them in the conversation. Well, it's you could not be a candidate and issue white papers and go on TV and sort of get your issues out there, but the sticking around to show that actual voters will show up when they connect with these issues that I care about, and actual kind of coalitions exist. That, I think, is actually a case for hanging on in that way. So, all right. That's the best thing you could do on a show is learn a little something, change your thinking. So I'll be curious what other people think. You can get in touch with us and let us know what you think of the hangers-on. And certainly we tried to name check as many throughout American history as possible, but I'm sure we missed many, many folks. Be in touch with us through email or through the newsletter or through the website. But we will conclude with Hangers-On Week. Not our only election-related coverage of this year, but this was really a fun first series to kick it off with. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
There never was a political convention to match the Democratic National Gathering of 1924 in New York for drama and color and bitterness. McAdoo against Al Smith. Day after day of fruitless balloting. Terrific storms of passion shaking the delegates and convulsing the thousands in the gallery. The high note of all, Franklin D. Roosevelt's presentation of the name of Alfred E. Smith, the deathless phrase, the happy warrior.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. We'll see you soon. Jody here. As you probably know, This Day is a member of Radiotopia, a network of original, creator-owned podcasts. What you might not know is that Radiotopia also has a monthly newsletter called The Citizen. It is packed with juicy details about new content, behind-the-scenes stories, upcoming events, and every once in a while you'll see a picture of a Radiotopia host and be like, oh, that's what they look like. So, if you love Radiotopia, you do not want to miss The Citizen. You can subscribe by going to radiotopia.fm/citizen. Thank you, and happy reading.
Radiotopia.